Hadi?
Yeah.
Opponents? And however many judges? Hadi Nine The OECD defines military aid as the supply of military equipment and services, which includes the training of police forces for paramilitary purposes. Observation 1. Instability is imminent in the Sahel. A 2009 Berkeley study warns that climate change will cause a 50% increase in civil wars across Africa. Observation 2. Instability is the most important issue in the Sahel because it harms development. Economist Paul Collier calculates that the average civil war sets back development by 21 years in the afflicted nation. Convention 1. Counter-narcotics. Latin American cartels annually smuggle up to $14 billion of cocaine through Western Sahel to Europe. This infiltration has increased corruption and violence, and an ACS report by Mike Denning explained that Mali's recent collapse was due to cartel activities. Military aid solves the problem through the US-funded WACSI, which trains elite police units to combat traffickers. According to a 2012 New York Times article, these programs will be modeled after those in Mexico, where police eliminated 70% of drug kingpins and succeeded in fragmenting cartels. Jamie Darabloom of the Hudson Institute explained that these cartels no longer pose a threat to the state, and Foreign Affairs reports that homicide rates are decreasing by 38% annually. Another military solution is cooperation between Western and Sahelian maritime and air forces to intercept drug shipments. Reuters reports in 2013 that in the Sahel, these interdictions have reduced the flow of cocaine by 60%. A 2013 SSI report by David Brown warns that unchecked cartels and traffickers will hijack elections, cause more coups, and pose an existential threat to 5 Sahelian nations. Convention 2. Peacekeeping. According to the OECD, military aid includes the expenditures on the enforcement aspects of peacekeeping. Empirically, UN peacekeeping missions have been successful in the Congo, where the Washington Post reports that the UN mission, with a strong emphasis on the use of force, was able to subdue and disperse members of the M23 rebel group. Ultimately, a 2010 University of Oslo study finds that UN missions reduce the chances of escalation in a civil war in a nation by 90%. Unfortunately, the UN warns that its peacekeeping programs are overstretched and underfunded. Immediately prioritizing these peacekeeping missions is thus key to stability. Convention 3. Developmental aid is counterproductive. Step 1A. Structural instability. Development aid creates problematic political systems. A study from the University of Zurich finds that aid is often misallocated by local government officials, thereby angering opposition groups and serving as a potential prize for seizing control of the government. Because of this, aid equivalent to 10% of the recipient nation's GDP causes 2.3 coups per decade. Furthermore, aid reduces the need for local tax collection. A 2008 World Bank analysis found that increasing aid by 13% causes an 8% decrease in the quality of tax collection. This dependency on aid rather than local taxes is deadly due to aid shocks, the sudden removal or reduction of aid for political reasons. This is because the sudden drop in resources weakens the government and encourages rebels to strike. And a 2010 study from BYU finds that each instance of aid shocks in a nation doubles the chance of a civil war in the following year. Subpoint B. Rent-seeking. Providing development assistance in even slightly unstable regions is counterproductive due to rent-seeking behaviors, whereby different groups try to control the flow of aid. Former aid worker Lisa Pullman analyzed 6 war zones and found that rebels stole between 25 and 80% of all aid. In his 2007 paper, bond analyst Adam Grooves found that this aid fuels the criminal economy, which is critical in supplying and sustaining rebellions. Furthermore, rebels launched attacks specifically to disrupt and steal aid, which is why a 2010 Harvard analysis of the Philippines found that development aid nearly doubled casualties from civil conflict. Thus, I urge a strong ballot. Thank you.
So with that, Max, are you ready? Opponents, audience, all 7 of my judges, we affirm. The Oxford English Dictionary defines prioritize as to designate as the most important. Contention 1, promoting good governance. UN Secretary General Kofi Annan wrote in 1998, good governance is the single most important factor in eradicating poverty and promoting development. Empirically, Dr. Kevin Sylvester of the University of Wisconsin finds that for sub-Saharan Africa, democratization increases economic growth in the long run by approximately Yamamoto of the State Department writes, poor governance and weak democratic institutions cultivate fertile ground for instability. Additionally, without good governance, military aid is counterproductive. For example, the Ethiopian government has used anti-terrorism aid to crack down on peaceful dissent and repress the rights of Muslims and others. However, democratic assistance can be targeted to promote good governance and democracy. According to Stephen Finkel of the University of Pittsburgh, targeted democracy assistance works to educate and empower voters, support political parties, labor unions, and women's advocacy networks, strengthen human rights groups, and otherwise build constituencies for reform. Governance aid is effective because sponsor states expect to see results and often require evidence of progress to renew the assistance. As the objective of the grants is specific and detailed, there's high accountability and transparency, and monitoring of these programs is simplified. For these reasons, James Scott of the Oklahoma State University empirically finds that democracy aid exerts a significant positive impact on democratization, where $10 million in democracy aid is associated with a 1-point increase in democracy score on a scale of 0 to 10. Furthermore, democracy aid directly reduces conflict. Marcus Sabun of the University of Pittsburgh finds that the conflict dampening effect of every dollar of democracy aid per 1,000 citizens is around 4%. Achieving good governance in Sahelian countries is entirely feasible. Yamamoto of the State Department writes that Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mauritania are all taking steps to improve governance. Our second contention is family planning. According to Malcolm Potts of Brooklyn University, many of the Sahel's problems today can be traced back 20 years to a decision by the UN and other international organizations to shift the focus away from family planning. While the Sahel's population is increasing at an unsustainably high rate and is expected to quadruple by 2050, only 8% of the family planning aid requested by the US Agency for International Development is currently being provided to the Sahel. Family planning aid is highly successful in the Sahel region. For example, a program conducted by the Gambia Family Planning Association with funding from US aid used radio broadcasts to educate about family planning and contraceptive use, which resulted in a 2-fold increase in the use of modern contraceptive methods. In Mali, a community-based distribution program run by US aid resulted in a 30-fold increase in women's use of modern contraceptive methods, and overall, Kathleen Beagle of the World Bank uses data from Ethiopia to find that access to family planning reduces fertility by more than 20%, or 1 birth per woman. This shows the following impacts. First is health. By decreasing the number of unplanned pregnancies, increased use of contraception leads to benefits to women's and children's health. According to the African Institute for Development Policy, contraceptive use has resulted in a 32% reduction in maternal deaths in sub-Saharan Africa, and an additional 29% of deaths could be averted if the unmet need for family planning is met. Furthermore, by decreasing the number of births and increasing the space between each birth, family planning can reduce deaths among children younger than 5 by 13 to 25%. The second is food security. According to the United Nations World Food Program, 11 million people in the Sahel are food insecure as a result of unsustainably high levels of population growth, and 230,000 children die each year of malnutrition. By decreasing fertility, family planning empirically increases food security. According to a study conducted by the Carolina Population Center, a decrease in fertility of half a child per woman would increase net calorie consumption by over 300 calories per person by 2050. The third is economic development. Dr. David Canning of Yale University finds that a reduction in fertility of 1 less child per woman would be associated with a 13.2% increase in gross domestic product per person after 20 years, rising to a 25.4% increase after 50 years when long-term effects are realized. For this reason, the United Nations Population Fund finds that for every dollar spent in family planning, $31 is returned in healthcare savings, education, and increased productivity. The fourth impact is democracy. Population Action International reports that high percentages of youth in a population are linked to an 8-fold decrease in the probability of observing democracy. In the Sahel, more than half of its population is under the age of 20, and family planning solves for this by reducing fertility. For these reasons, we strongly urge ballot in the affirmation.
Everybody ready?
Yes. Go ahead, you have the first question.
Yes. So can we agree that doing absolutely anything in the Sahel is easier if the region is stable?
Not necessarily.
What would be easier if we don't have terrorists doing car bombings, if we don't have rebels rising, if we don't have civil wars? What's not easier?
Sure, it might be easier, but none of these things are actually occurring in the vast majority of the Sahel.
Okay,
so that's not going to apply.
Easier. Okay, do you have a question for me?
I do have a question for you.
All right,
so your entire first contention is talking about counter narcotics. Okay. And so who is actually where's this drug trade coming from?
Where's the drug trade coming from? Basically, what we're looking at is cartels that throughout Western Sahel, throughout
the cartels, right?
Yes, cartels in Western Sahel, which are creating instability. We saw that effect in Mali.
Can I ask you a question? Okay, about that collapse in Mali.
Yes.
How did the cartels cause this collapse in Mali?
So what we're seeing here is when these cartels are working in Mali, they're bribing government officials. They're trying to exert control over the government.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Sure,
go ahead.
So, and when these cartels eventually come into so much conflict that it's going to create this instability which leads to
essentially you're telling me that there's a link between these cartels and the governments, right? These cartels,
cases, yes.
the governments are the ones actively perpetrating the drug trade, right? So
actively.
Yes, actively. So if we reform the governments and we decrease corruption, which is what we're telling you in our first contention, all of these impacts are better solved with democracy assistance. Do you have a question for me?
Okay. So you talk about so in your second contention, you're talking about food security. how there's like 11 million starving people, like 200,000 kids are dying every year.
Yes.
So we're going to be increasing agriculture, we're going to be giving them food, we're going to be...
No, what we're talking about is specifically reducing the population.
Just reducing the population.
Reducing the
nothing
population.
else. Nothing else.
So that's what we're talking about in our second contention.
Okay.
Can I ask you a question about your second contention, which is about peacekeeping?
Go ahead.
And you're telling me that only the military activities of the peacekeepers are going to have all of these effects, right?
Yeah,
So
basically when a United Nations mission goes into a nation, which is relatively insecure, may not be insecure, whatever, it decreases the chance of civil war in that nation by 90%.
Okay. Can I ask you a question about that?
Okay.
The study you're talking about, the University of Oslo, it's talking about the effective 90% decrease in conflict. It's talking about transitional peacekeeping operations. Insofar as you're telling me that it's only the military activities of the peacekeepers, and the study is actually talking about them holding elections, them supporting the government, all these activities that are not military aid, and in fact are development assistance, how are you getting any impact on this contention?
Can you do any of that in a war zone?
First of all,
terrorists all over the place, you can have an election.
The problem is that you're talking about is that the specific advocacy which you provide in the second contention is about the military activities of these peacekeepers. Insofar as I agree that those military activities are military aid, but the other activities, which it might be a prerequisite, but the other activities are development assistance, and the 90% decrease in conflict is going to be development assistance.
So,
is it a question?
So basically, using this military force is a prerequisite to anything else. Are we
Not
agreed on that?
necessarily.
Not, you just said that. Okay.
Slow, and finally return to the idea of peacekeeping, what it is, what it isn't. Alright? So, framework. We disagree with the idea that what is most important is what we should prioritize. Instead, we should prioritize what we have to do first. If something is a prerequisite for another action, you have to prioritize that prerequisite, otherwise you will never access the benefits to that second step, i.e. development aid. And furthermore, extended framework is how work agent tells you the Sahel is going to be unstable in the future, even if it isn't now. Berkeley tells you climate change will cause a 50% increase in civil wars. They're going to tell you that family planning solves for climate change. Don't buy it, it takes too long. And secondly, according to a Der Spiegel article, Nigeria is already on the brink of being ungovernable, Senegal on the brink of a civil war, and the Sahel is covered with armed civilians who could easily turn into terrorists or generate further instability. So with that in mind, on the bench one about good governance, we have a few responses. Firstly, in Crossfire, or when asked for evidence, my opponents couldn't specify who they are giving democracy aid to. So at that point, we default to general aid. And aid data tells you we spent $2 billion of general government-to-government development aid for democracy in the Sahel since 2010. So at that point, all of our aid bad, like offense from our case, extends. So at that point, you're seeing that increasing this aid to government is causing 2.3 coups per decade, government-to-government general aid, and you're seeing that a 13% increase in aid causes an 8% decrease in tax base. Don't have a tax base, the government isn't accountable to its people, you're turning democracy. Furthermore, looking at aid shocks, double percent of the civil war. So at that point, this general, unspecified actor aid is accessing all of the aid bad arguments in our case. But secondly, according to the Polity IB Index, 9 out of 12 Sahelian nations are actually partial democracies and not full democracies. Why? Even if our aid is creating democracy in some areas, in the long run it's undermining the tax base, which is critical to any government being accountable to its people. And partial democracies are terrible, because according to Jackie Cilliers in a 2010 report, partial democracies are 600% more likely to experience civil war than full democracies, and 250% more likely to experience civil war than an autocracy. So at that point, you're applying civil war impacts. Thirdly, you can actually turn all the civil society aid against them. Why? When we set up professional networks between aid agencies and local Africans, we encourage local Africans to use the networks to leave their country. This is why a 2009 study from New Mary University found that increasing aid by 1% causes an 11% increase in the flight of highly skilled Africans. If setting up these civil society democracy programs is only making the leaders leave, we are undermining the middle class, undermining the economy, undermining Sahelian nations, and turning every single one of democracy impacts against them. Now, let's just talk about family planning. We have a few responses. Firstly, extend the Der Spiegel card. Nigeria is going to be ungovernable very soon. Nigeria is a country of 220 million people, is basically the majority of the Sahel. At that point, it's going to be ungovernable in the near future. Contraceptives is not going to be implemented. But secondly, according to an LA Times article, even bringing projects that they're talking about to scale, as in all the Sahel, will cost billions of dollars in 20 years. And that's just getting the programs up and running. After that 20 years, you have to actually reduce birth rates. So at that point, the solvency is incredibly long term. Whereas in the here and now, the Sahel is going to be ungovernable extremely soon, rendering contraceptive solvency completely not working, because you can't implement contraceptive solvency if the entire region is in a civil war, which the Berkeley evidence tells you it's going to be. But secondly, this is also extremely critical, Look to the brain drain card. Extend it to health. If we're trying to encourage concept abuse among local Africans, we're also encouraging brain drain among local African medical professionals. And according to a study from the World Bank in 2008, brain drain that roughly doubles the rate of doctors leaving causes a 20% increase in AIDS deaths in Africa. So their contraceptive programs, which encourage doctors to leave, are causing a 20% increase in AIDS deaths. And according to a study from Indiana University, AIDS actually guts local military capacities, further reducing the ability to contain civil wars, and further reducing the ability to have stability overall over the entire region. And thirdly, again, this is another AIDS card. So according to a New York Times report from 2012, the most popular contraceptive for women in Eastern and Southern Africa appears to double the risk that women will become infected with HIV. Again, you're increasing AIDS because the contraceptives they use in Africa are counterproductive and increase AIDS transmissions. At that point, you're increasing AIDS furthermore, undermining the militaries more, harming the economy more. And finally, on peacekeeping, they're going to tell you that peacekeeping should be development aid, but according to a Washington Post article from literally 2 weeks ago, the type of peacekeeping which emphasizes development in South Sudan has failed, and the kind of peacekeeping that emphasizes shooting rebels like in Congo succeeds. So comparatively, peacekeeping is better when it's used in a military framework.
So starting on framework issues, they tell you that prioritize means what comes first, but that doesn't make any sense at the point at which right now we're implementing both military aid and development aid. So clearly there doesn't necessarily need to be like this trade-off. So let's go to what they're telling you in their observations. First of all, they're telling you that instability is imminent due to global warming. But if you look at why global warming will lead to this instability, it's because of food insecurity, which we solve for in our case. We give you that evidence, like with lower fertility rates, we can maximize calorie intake per person. That's going to mitigate any of those effects. We can also use development aid to prevent food insecurity by like revitalizing agriculture and just teaching people new ways of sustainable agriculture. According to a study by the Overseas Development Aid Project, like agriculture aid specifically in Ghana increased crop yields by 85 to 350%. So again, we can solve for this with development aid. So like right where we're solving at the root cause of all this violence, like we're going to be outweighing. But also, they tell you that instability is happening in the Sahel. But the fact of the matter is, according to a study from Dowd of the Trinity College in 2013, the vast majority of violence is in the Sahel is happening exclusively in Mali. And if we take Mali out of the equation, the Sahel is comparatively the most peaceful region in Africa. So what the resolution is asking us to do is to craft a regional policy for the entire Sahel. So we should be looking to the issues that are endemic to the entire Sahel, like poverty, like famine, like underdevelopment. Those are the things that we tackle in our case. That's why we're outweighing. Let's go to their first contention about counter-narcotics. I'm going to have 3 general responses. First of all, the governments of these countries are involved in these in this drug trafficking. So helping them and like helping government institutions isn't going to solve anything. If you actually want to do that, the first thing you need to do is eliminate corruption, is eliminate the problems that cause the government to be involved in the drug traffic. And that's why you look to our first convention, where we specifically tell you that we can create more accountable, better governments. And in fact, according to New York Times, in Guinea-Bissau and Mali specifically, drug and human trafficking were things that the government and the military were involved in. So if you're strengthening the police, which is controlled by the government, you're actually going to just allow to further perpetuate these problems. But second of all, militaristic approaches to drug trafficking have always failed in the past. According to the Nassau Institute for Global Health, harsh law enforcement and militaristic approaches for controlling supply and demand of illicit drugs have had serious human rights implications, with physical abuse, sexual assault, public humiliation, denial of legal representation, and mortality being reported in the name of law enforcement. So at that point, if they think instability is a problem, they're going to be increasing it by trying to use the military to fight drugs. But third, development aid can actually solve for this problem of drugs. And in fact, in Afghanistan and Thailand, they instituted these projects where they subsidized farmers to stop growing plants like poppies for opium and coca for cocaine, and instead use to grow other crops. And that actually resulted in a massive decline in drug production in those areas. So we can actually solve for these things with development aid. At that point, when we're solving better for this issue than they are themselves, you're going to be looking to our side. Then they talk about naval interdiction. There's a very big problem with that argument, which is that we're looking at policies regarding the Sahel region of Africa, right? If they're talking about stuff that's going on in the Indian Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean, it's not in the Sahel. I'm sorry, that's not going to be like what we should set as our priority for the entire Sahel region. Is like that just doesn't make any sense because it's not happening in the Sahel, right? Let's go to their second contention about peacekeeping. I'm going to have a couple of responses. First of all, peacekeepers have been highly ineffective in the past. In fact, like the biggest atrocities that have happened in the past 20 years, like Bosnia, Rwanda, and Darfur, peacekeepers were literally there, miles away from where violence was happening, and they didn't actually intervene. They completely failed. Moreover, Thomas Jacobson of Hamilton Public Policy Center writes, peacekeepers are lightly armed, retreat if challenged or attacked, and rarely, if ever, protect innocent civilians. So we're not seeing any solvency. But second of all, even if you buy that peacekeepers are a good thing, you're going to look to the fact that the UN can't just increase the number of peacekeepers. Like they themselves tell you that right now these peacekeepers are overstretched in the region, and the UN is sending as many as they possibly can. And the reason is the UN doesn't have a standing army, and they can't institute a draft. So they rely entirely on volunteers, and at the point at which they're deploying as many volunteers as they can right now, we're not actually going to be seeing any kind of solvency, even if it were a good thing to increase the number of UN peacekeepers. But also their Oslo evidence is talking about transitional peacekeeping operations. These peacekeeping operations don't actually focus on combat, they focus on supporting elections and human rights. That's development aid. The actor doesn't determine what type of aid it is. Go to the third condition, it's not responsive at all to our case, and these things can be accounted for by the lurking variable. Like countries that are more corrupt and have more conflict are the poorer ones. That's why we're giving them more aid. So don't look to any of their evidence there. Thank you.
Well, not right now, but like empirically, UN peacekeepers reduce conflict by 90%. All your peacekeeper fail arguments, like how do they apply if the empirics
First of
they
all,
work?
that study is looking at transitional peacekeeping operations, not like peacekeepers where they engage in combat or anything like that. These transitional peacekeeping operations are not actually military aid insofar as they're like providing humanitarian assistance.
The Washington Post evidence tells you that in Africa, UN missions that focus on the military, like in
That's
Congo,
different evidence, though.
and the ones
That's
that
different evidence, though. I'm
Alright,
talking about the 90%
clearly the
one.
PKOs work
The
because you're using
90% one
military aid.
is turned directly against you because it's development aid.
Hail is a powder keg. If you look through a Berkeley card, you can extend it uncontested the entire round. 52% increase in civil wars because of climate change. If you look to Spiegel, right now in Nigeria, on the verge of collapse, and throughout the entire Sahel, people are walking around with AKs. It's not going to work. It's going to collapse, almost like right now, pretty much. So we're seeing a very unstable region that's about to implode, and therefore you have to talk about time frame. So because of time frame, you can't look at something that's happening in 20 years, if the entire region is about to implode. You have to look to what's going to stop this crisis right now. You can't look to anything else that's going to happen later. 20 years, cool. If we're having a war-torn zone, what's the big deal? So now in that case, let's talk about health. Sorry, let's talk about peacekeeping, in fact. So our Washington Post card says that in Sudan, development peacekeeping failed because we were using the developmental aspects of it. We were talking about de-arming, et cetera, that sort of thing. But in the Congo, when we use military aspects of peacekeeping, peacekeepers coming in, guns blazing, killing rebels, killing terrorists, that worked. Empirically, what we're advocating for has worked. So you can extend that throughout the round. Next, you can look to health. So the fact is, contraceptives actually make 2 times more HIV. African contraceptives don't work. And also, again, time frame. 20 years, war zone. First, you can't implement this in a war zone. Do you want to go around spreading contraceptives, getting shot at? No one wants to do that. So first of all, you need to stop the instability first. You need to stop these civil wars before they start. Lastly, government aid is bad. You're looking, when we increase government aid, you're seeing 13% increase in developmental aid, 8% decrease in taxes. We're seeing this creating partial democracies 600 times more likely to have a civil war, a coup, than a democracy, a full-on democracy. Again, independent voter right there. And lastly, when we do this 10% increase in aid, developmental aid leads to 2.3 coups per decade. Right there, I see no other option but con. Thank you.
Most importantly, all 7 judges. Remember the Dowd evidence, which tells you that violence is not endemic to the Sahel region. We should be crafting regional policy based on the endemic issues, which are corruption and family planning. They tell you that it's a powder keg, but remember, we're solving for this in the short run with good governance, and in the long run with family planning. With that, let's move on to the first contention, which is good governance. And they're telling you that we're talking about general aid, and that we don't give evidence that it's targeted. Remember, Finkel tells you specifically how we're targeting this aid, and in the methodology, I encourage the judges to look at the methodology. It's extremely targeted, and it requires evidence of it being successful to be repeated. At that point, extend the evidence from Michael Scott, who tells you that $10 million in democracy aid increases democratization by 1 point on a scale of 0 to 10. Next, they give a couple of the responses to good governance. Talk about aid shocks, which only happens when we decrease aid. So at that point, you have to prioritize increasing aid. And tax bases, remember, we solve this in the long run by promoting long-term development. Remember the Sylvester card, which tells you when we have democracies, more long-term growth, it's going to solve for this tax issue. Then they're talking about conflict, and that 9 out of 12 are partial democracies, which is the exact reason you have to prioritize development aid. These partial democracies are occurring naturally. These partial democracies are occurring. These countries are democratizing, but if we give them more aid, they're going to democratize faster and become full democracies. And the second reason is Barclay Seguin of the University of Pittsburgh empirically finds that when democratization occurs, yes, conflict goes up, but specifically when we give the targeted democracy aid, we show that for every $1 per 1,000 people, there's a 4% decrease in conflict, so we're solving this on net. Next, let's look at this idea of brain drain. And this is going to be not an issue whatsoever in the round because their evidence is talking about the effect of aid targeted specifically to reduce migration. At that point, we're not advocating for that sort of aid at all. I encourage you to take the evidence and look at it. It's not applicable whatsoever. Drop it off the flow. They have no responses to our first or second contention. On our second contention, they tell you it'll take 20 years to solve, but the card concedes in the next sentence, there's no other way to solve regional instability. At that point, extend all 4 of our impacts, which are going to be, remember, health. By providing contraceptives, we're going to decrease maternal deaths by 29%, food security, 300 calories per person, long-term economic growth, and democracy. Remember that military aid is only going to be counterproductive because the governments themselves that are perpetrating these actions, and by solving for that, we solve for the root cause of the problem. Thank you.
The Spiegel article, that's one piece, first of all. Secondly, Spiegel article tells you that Nigeria is on the brink of being ungovernable and Senegal is on the brink of civil war, and there are people with
It's on the brink of being ungovernable, again, because the government is corrupt, because the government is inefficient. By solving for that, we solve for the problem.
Okay, so you don't solve for that. No, I asked you, no, this is critical. This is critical, it's absolutely critical.
Sure.
I asked you who you gave aid to like 15 minutes ago. You didn't give me an answer. At that point, it is abusive for you to claim that you don't defend general aid when you didn't tell me what you're actually defending.
Okay, yeah. So, first of all, like that's exactly our point. We're not giving adequate targeted democracy aid to the Sahel. That's why we should give it. Okay, so like that.
Wait, so it's never worked.
The evidence is looking to all overall in the world, wherever the various places we've given it. So we're saying we should give it to the Sahel.
So your evidence is like it might have worked somewhere else.
No,
so we should try it and maybe it'll work.
Empirically, it did work.
And the second
no, you just said you have no empirics.
Yes, I have the Scott study, which finds that $10 million in targeted democracy aid results in a
10 million blanket dollars. I don't think you should
in targeted democracy aid.
Where is it targeted?
Alright, fair enough. Who are they targeting? You didn't tell me 10 million.
Okay, we explained to you they're giving it to labor unions, to women's empowerment groups.
Why didn't you tell me that 10 minutes ago?
Because I read it in my case.
You want me to read directly from our case where we tell you? Would you like me to read that?
Sorry, I can read it directly from the case. Stephen Finkel of the University of Pittsburgh, targeted blah blah blah. It educates and empowers political parties, labor unions, and women's advocacy networks, strengthens human rights groups, and otherwise.
Right, but your only solid score based on that is a $10 million.
I can give you examples of countries in Africa where we've implemented it. Would that satisfy you?
I don't really think so because
I'll
explain why. Even if you are defending targeting aid, your behavior about 10 minutes ago indicates you also have to defend general aid, right?
No,
if I base my rebuttal on like general aid, you didn't give me an answer, and then you suddenly say it's targeted.
Just like you're blaming us for the fact that you mischaracterized and you didn't understand our argument. That's not our fault.
I'm going to ask you about a new question. New issue. Let's move on. Aid shocks. Basically, what you're telling me with aid shocks is that less aid is bad, right?
Yeah. According to the IMF, we tried to prioritize aid to make aid shocks like not happen, and it's actually counterproductive. Okay, like it literally didn't help at all.
Let's go with like the logic of aid shocks, right?
Right.
The logic is if we decrease the amount of aid, we see more conflict, right?
So we phase out slowly. We phase out slowly. Easy.
Okay, so isn't that a reason not to decrease the amount of aid?
We phase out slowly and steadily. No
how does it work at all for your side? Why are you making arguments?
Because when you provide more democracy aid, politics means there's going to be random drops like guaranteed. There's no solid.
Why is that?
Because the IMF tried to fix it. It didn't work.
Okay.
All right.
The framework, which includes time frame, government stuff, then onto governance aid, stability, and then governance, health, stability. Does that work? All right. Start with the framework. All right, their cost evidence happens 20 years from now, right? So at that point, we prove that conditions are going to change before that 20-year time frame. They're getting absolutely no solvency of contract. Why will conditions change? The Spiegel evidence. Nigeria, 220 million people, biggest country in Sahel, is literally on the brink of being ungovernable. That means there's no government to strengthen with democracy. It's on the brink of being ungovernable. Furthermore, Berkeley evidence tells you 50% increase in civil wars. They have not done enough work to prove to you that it's not going to collapse. Provide you multiple pieces of evidence. Sahel is going to collapse. So at that point, evaluate the impact in this round based on a collapsing Sahel with limited governance structures. And furthermore, the idea of government aid, okay, I concede some targeted can work, and they do win some targeted solvency, but they still have to defend general aid. Why? They didn't give me a target earlier in the round, and furthermore, empirically in the Sahel, all we've given is $2 billion in general government-to-government aid. So empirically, you're looking through general government-to-government aid in the round. So the first voter is that governance aid is absolutely terrible. So look to the fact that you get 2.3 Qs per decade due to governance aid. Look at the fact that increasing aid by 13% decreases taxes by 8%. If you're decreasing the
tax base, there is absolutely zero accountability between the government and its people. At that point, you're causing further instability, you're reducing governance, even if there was a government to have, which there won't be in Nigeria, and there won't be in the Sahel, because it's going to completely collapse before any of their impacts can come to fruition. The next issue is health, right, and contraceptives. So contraceptives is a 20-year time frame. They can see that. If it collapses before that, they have absolutely no solvency. Nigeria, biggest country, ungovernable. No solvency. Furthermore, you double AIDS. That's a unique term. You're doubling with the biggest disease there. That's clearly a term on health. They're losing the ground right there. Development is absolutely terrible. Don't prioritize it. They straight drop the AIDS contention. And finally, on the point about peacekeeping, right? So again, in Congo, when the UN focused on military peacekeeping, we succeeded. In South Sudan, when we focused on like elections and stuff, we failed. So at that point, the 90% card is flowing to us because the warrants say the way it reduces it is through military action. So at that point, the only way to stop the imminent collapse of all the Sahel and all government institutions is to implement UN peacekeeping missions like really soon that use guns to kill rebels and protect states and reduce conflict by 90%. Thank you.
So in terms of priority, they can see that it's going to be important because there's this false, they're giving you a false dichotomy in terms of we have to choose one or the other. They also concede that the conflict isn't happening right now, it's going to happen, and they say it's going to happen because of global warming, and the reason why is food shortages, and we're solving for that. So if we solve for that, then the conflicts will never happen in the first place. At that point, we're going to be winning ground. And we give you the Overseas Development Institute, which says that in Ghana, we were able to increase crop yields by 85 to 350%. That never gets responded to. We also link into it through contraceptive. We show you that we can increase calorie consumption by 300 per person by 2050. So at that point, we're going to be solving for these issues. The conflict will never happen, so we'll never have to use that military aid. There's no reason to prioritize it. Let's go to the first issue, which is democracy. Remember, it's the prerequisite for any kind of actual solvency, any kind of long-term development, and their responses just don't make any sense. They're telling you that, like, they're giving you responses as to why overall aid is bad, but we're talking about targeted democracy aid. We're saying it's not being implemented in the Sahel, and that's the reason it should be, because it has been effective in the past in the world. We're giving you the Scott evidence, $10 million. It's going to see a 1-point increase in democracy on a 10-point scale. That doesn't get responded to, and it's talking specifically about targeted democracy aid. Their other response was partial democracy. But we actually take that into account in our case with Barcus of UKIT, who says that when we give, sure, there tends to be this conflict increase. When there's democratization, there tends to be conflict, but when we give $1 per 1,000 people, it has a 4% conflict dampening effect. So at that point we're solving, and we're also getting access to that peacekeeping, the peacekeeping card that they're giving you, Holtman, which is talking about transitional peacekeeping operations, which are not actual combat operations, but rather things that actually promote human rights and promote democracy. So at that point, we're getting access to the biggest impact in the round. Second voting issue is going to be contraception. They tell you that it causes AIDS, but we're primarily talking about things like pills, which I don't see how contraceptive pills can cause AIDS. And they're telling you it takes 20 years to solve, but the next sentence after that says that that's the only solvency for instability. So if they think that's very important evidence, then that's going to preclude their entire case. They're not going to be solving for instability, and we're going to get access to all the impacts that we're giving you. A 29% reduction in maternal deaths. We're going to see actual economic growth, and when we see economic growth, this brain drain argument isn't going to come into effect because we're going to be creating jobs, we're going to be expanding the economy, and that's going to solve for all the issues in the round. Thank you.